Questions nobody asks. With a John Michael Swifter. What, was that bad?
What's up, YouTube? So one of my students asked me the other day what my opinion of A432 as a pitch standard was. And a good part of me was like, oh my god, not this question again. But the more I thought about it, I realized this was a really incredibly teachable moment. Some would think that this case should be really open and shut, but there's still a really strong controversy around this idea. And the extremes that you're dealing with are pretty far from each other. On one end, you have this kind of new age conspiracy theory where sometimes you feel like the arguments aren't even grammatical enough to quote the pseudoscience correctly. And on the other end, you have this kind of intellectual elitism that basically dismisses the whole thing on the basis of its own science-ness, without even really considering it. And then you have kind of the impressionable middle, which is where I am. There's a lot to get into with this, and there's some real hidden gems, beyond just the normal controversy, so I'm probably going to do more than one Q&A on this in a row. But everyone's been asking me, what's my opinion of 432, ostensibly because I'm an expert of some kind. But what I'm going to do is give the most objective presentation of the concepts and facts that I can, starting with sort of an armchair history of pitch standards and tuning theory, and eventually I'm going to turn the question around and ask you, what's your opinion of 432? Q&A. The story of A432 is a story of science, math, culture, and music all woven together throughout human history. Ancient China, India, Greece, Sumeria, pretty much any ancient culture that knew about mathematics studied its relationship with music. The main focus of this is the harmonic series, which is both a mathematical and a natural phenomenon which has a very intimate relationship with how human beings perceive pitch relationships. In a nutshell, you can use the harmonic series as a mathematical tool for creating pleasing sounding scales. But in order to generate those pleasing sounding scales, you need what's called a generating tone, or a starting note from which the other pitches can be calculated. This system of creating scales based on the harmonic series is called just intonation, and it was pretty much the original way of developing scales for every culture. And one of the problems in the early systems was that most civilizations lacked the science to create a consistent time base for anything more fine than a sundial. And this basically means they can't replicate a consistent pitch standard exactly. So what you'll find is that most of the early pitch standards are actually based on animal sounds. If you look back at the theoretical writings of Matanga and Bharata and a lot of the early Indian music theorists, they would actually discuss the sargam syllables in relationship to the cries of animals, like the peacock or the elephant. And this is actually a fairly effective way to get a consistent pitch base because genetically speaking, the vocal ranges of animals don't change a lot relative to the course of human history. So even though the courses of thousands of years, you could get a fairly consistent pitch base by studying animals. And this is actually true for humans too, which you're going to find is going to be very relevant to our story later on. So even up to the Baroque era in European history, there really was no consistent pitch standard or even much of a consideration for one. But during the 1700s especially, cultural forces started to force Europeans to consider the importance of a pitch standard. Forces like greater social and travel mobility, the physics of instruments, and also the Industrial Revolution all pushed European societies towards a pitch standardization. Now, mobility is significant because you have musicians traveling more and playing with each other and sharing their music and their scores, and this just generally encouraged them to be on the same page somehow. It has been argued that when instrumental music was popular in Europe, it caused the tendency of the pitch base to rise, called pitch inflation. And the basic reason for this is that if you look at the physics of strings especially, when you make the string more tense, it causes the upper partials of the strings to become either out of tune or intensified, which causes the tone of the string to be brighter and more piercing, which causes it to be either considered more exciting or more projecting or somehow more engaging to the listener. And so it's argued that instrumentalists in general want the pitch base to be higher so that they're more audible, so that their sense of, power of their expressiveness is greater. The Industrial Revolution, for obvious reasons, pushes everything towards standardization, from the normal goods that you have every day to the types of instruments you're using to the pitch base that everyone is using to play that music. In 1711, the tuning fork was invented, at least as a way of keeping individual musicians in tune. Now, at this time, there was still no way for Europeans to consistently reproduce a time time base, but we can use these tuning forks as forensic evidence to understand what the pitch bases were at that time. And we do know that there really was no consistency, is that, we have Handel's tuning forks, and we have Mozart's tuning forks, we have tuning forks from all over Europe, and these pitch bases varied tremendously from in the 377 range to in the 500 range, which is many, many semitones. So basically, the pitch standards were wild and disparate. In 1830, a silk manufacturer named Johann Scheibler actually invented a tonometer using many, many tuning forks, which actually could fairly accurately scientifically measure the speed in cycles per second of a tuning fork. Now today, we do this measurement with quartz crystals and electrical currents and relate it to some number of rotations of the Earth in something like that. But, in Scheibler's time, 1830, this was the first way to actually create a consistent cycles per second measurement. But inevitably, the science of measuring got better and better and better as time went on. And there was another important scientific and musical invention going on at this time. Scientists and mathematicians were working together in Europe to create different tuning systems called temperaments, which were actually moving away from the just intonation system. Just intonation is subject to a mathematical phenomenon known as the fundamental theorem of arithmetic, which we'll discuss more later. But it basically means that when you're playing in just intonation, you can only play in a limited number of keys, but the tones in certain keys that are distant from the generating tone aren't going to you can't make them in tune. So European mathematicians and keyboardists were basically trying to develop tuning systems which sort of stretched the tuning a bit to make you able to play in more keys so you could modulate more. This will also become significant later in our story. And one of the problems with the pitch inflation that was going on at this time was that, as we said before, the genetics of certain instruments weren't changing, like human voices in particular won't get any higher, even though instruments can be made to play higher fairly easily. Ostensibly, this was the reason for the first setting of pitch standards. In 1859, February 16th, the French government set the first national pitch standard at A435, ostensibly because opera singers at the time were complaining that the pitch was getting too high for them to sing. And this makes a lot of sense if you consider the fact that scores are written in certain keys and you don't want to have to rewrite all the scores, but that changing the pitch standard is in fact going to objectively raise the pitch that the singer has to sing all the time. Muscularly, it's very tiring. This A435 standard eventually became known as continental pitch, and many places either did fully adopt it or made attempts to adopt it. In 1884, Giuseppe Verdi, the famous Romantic-era opera composer, actually wrote a letter to the Italian government imploring them to adopt 435 as the national standard because he said the pitch for his singers was becoming so high that it was losing its drama and its freedom. As European imperialism spread, so did the pitch standards that Europe was using spread all over the world, and they have eventually come to be essentially hegemonic. But at the same time as the Industrial Revolution was encouraging everything in the world, the culture of the entire world, to become standardized, so there were countercultural movements that were trying to combat the standardization. Theosophism and other religious spiritual movements at the time railed against the standardization and the unification of culture and encouraged people to be more individualistic and to focus more on a harmony with nature. In 1921, Rudolf Steiner, a very strong proponent of essentially a theosophist movement, argued that C, the new concert pitch, should be set at 128 because of its resonance with certain natural phenomena such as celestial bodies and certain spiritual phenomena such as archangels. In 1985, Maria Reynolds wrote a book called Intervals, Scales, and Tones, expounding on these ideas and explicating them in a musical system, but essentially referring to Steiner's ideas. The International Organization for Standardization set A440 as the concert pitch standard in 1955 and has since reaffirmed it, despite the Schiller Institute's conference in 1988, to change it to 432. Now, of course, with the advent of the internet, there has become a much greater interest in 432 as a pitch standard. And the current cultural movement really focuses on 432's superiority as a pitch standard due to its compatibility with certain natural phenomena and certain possible biospiritual significances. 432 advocates also argue that 432 has been identified as an ideal pitch standard since ancient civilizations. It has also been argued that 440 is in fact a disharmonious standard that has been secretly imposed by politically empowered malefactors who are essentially trying to disrupt the society of humanity. What is true and what is false about these claims? That is something we are going to investigate over the next couple of episodes. If you dug this video so far, stick around for the next couple ones, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel so you catch the other crazy stuff I'm doing. More on this next time. Deuces, y'all.